the hell's that?
Well, I feel pretty stupid. I was not using my cameras correct. I wasn't using it in 1080p as had it set to like default device resolution.
Alright, so now we have the camera and the correct widescreen resolution. Doesn't look so bad. Keep listening to this Lord of the Rings online ambience. And you can see like the whole bookshelves. Pretty fancy. Time, and it's time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. Time. Devouring time. Wasteful time. This bloody tyrant time. Time is the predatory villain, with whom not only the lover, but all men must contend. The sonnets of Shakespeare make war upon time's tyranny. To stay time's scythe, to preserve whatever of value can be kept from the wastes of time, and to prove that love's not time's fool entirely. Yet, viewing the almost universal depredations of time, the poet fears that love may not escape time's ruin. When I have seen by time's fell hand defaced the rich, proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal, slave to mortal rage, when I have seen the hungry ocean gain advantage on the kingdom of the shore, and the firm soil win of the watery main, increasing store with loss, and loss with store, when I have seen such interchange of state, or state itself confounded to decay. Ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away, as thought is as a death which cannot choose, but weep to have that which it fears to lose. The lover knows that he cannot save his love from change and her beauty from decay. Time is too much for him, but when the lover is also a poet, he may hope to defeat time, not by making his love last forever, but by making the memory of it immortal. Do thy worst, old time, he can say. Despite thy wrong, my love shall in my verse ever lie young. Or again, since brass nor stone nor earth nor boundless sea, but sad mortality oversways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wreckful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays. O fearful meditation, where, alack, shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? O none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright. But the poet may have the cast of a theologian rather than a lover. He may, as Milton does, stand not in awe or fear, but in contempt of time, willing to wait while time runs out its race. Milton bids time, glut thyself with what thy womb devours, which is no more than what is false and vain, and merely mortal dross. So little is our loss, so little is thy gain. For when as each thing bad thou hast entombed, and last of all thy greedy self consumed, then long eternity shall greet our bliss with an individual kiss. Then all this earthly grossness quit. Attired with stars we shall forever sit, triumphing over death and chance and thee, O time. A philosopher like Marcus Aurelius neither defies nor despises time. He enjoins himself to accept the mutability of all things as fitting and suitable to universal nature. Dost thou not see, he asks himself, that for thyself also to change is just the same and equally necessary for the universal nature? To him it seems no evil for things to undergo change. Nor is he oppressed by the image of time as a river made up of the events which happen and a violent stream, for as soon as a thing has been seen it is carried away, and another comes in its place, and this will be carried away too. For man to resign himself to time's passage, Pascal thinks, requires no special effort. Our nature consists in motion, he says. Complete rest is death. Time fits our nature, not only because it heals griefs and quarrels, but because time's perpetual flow washes away the desperate ennui men suffer when they feel themselves imprisoned in the present. I suppose that's true. Just as we seek and multiply diversions as means to escape from ourselves, so, according to Pascal, when we are dissatisfied with the present, we anticipate the future as too slow in coming, or we recall the past to stop its too rapid flight. For the present is generally painful to us, Let each one examine his thoughts, and he will find them all occupied with the past and the future. The past and present are our means. The future alone is our end. So we never live, but we hope to live. And as we are always preparing to be happy, it is inevitable we should never be so. There are only some of the conflicting attitudes. These are only some of the conflicting attitudes toward time and mutability, which express man's desire for permanence, for the eternity of a now that stands still, or his restless weariness, his avidity for the novelties time holds in store. Wherever in the great books of poetry, philosophy, or history, men reflect upon their loves and aspirations, their knowledge and their institutions, they face man's temporality. It is not that man alone of earthly things has a time-ridden existence, but that his memory and imagination enable him to encompass time and to save him from being merely rooted in it. Man not only reaches out to the past and future, but he also sometimes lifts himself above the whole of time by conceiving the eternal and immutable and the immutable. Man's apprehension of the past and future is discussed in the chapter on memory and imagination. The bent of his mind, or his striving toward the unchanging, the everlasting, the eternal, is considered in the chapter on change. Here we are concerned with his examination of time itself. Though the idea of time is traditionally linked with that of space, it seems to be much more difficult to grasp. In addition to provoking opposite emotions from the poets, it seems to engage the philosophers in a dispute about its intelligibility. This goes deeper than conflicting definitions or analyses, such as occur in the discussion of both space and time. Whereas time seems no less clear than space to some thinkers, to others it is irremediably obscure. Struggling to say what it is and how it exists, they are exasperated by its evanescence as an object of thought. Aristotle indicates some initial difficulties in the consideration of time. It is not itself a movement, yet neither does time exist without change. Time is neither movement nor independent of movement. Furthermore, according to Aristotle, time is a continuous quantity. Time, past, present, and future, forms a continuous whole, but the very nature of a continuous quantity is to be divisible. The present moment, however, the now, which is the link of time and the dividing line between past and future, seems to be an indivisible instant. If the present had an extended duration, Aristotle points out, it would have to include parts, some of which would be past and some future. Hence, though the present seems to be a part of time, it is, unlike the rest of time, indivisible, and though it separates past and future, yet it must also somehow belong to both, for otherwise time would not be continuous. The now is an end and a beginning of time. Not of the same time, however, but the end of that which is past and the beginning of that which is to come. If we conceive of some point of time which cannot be divided into even the minutest parts of moments, Augustine writes that that is the only point that can be called the present, and that point flees at such lightning speed from being future to being past that it has no extent of duration at all. Only past time and future time can be called long or short. Only they have duration. But in what sense, Augustine asks, can that which does not exist be long or short? The past no longer is. The future is not yet. It's pretty trippy. The past and future, it seems, have duration, or at least extent, but no existence. The present exists, but does not endure. What then is time? If no one asks me, Augustine says, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know. All the words with which we speak of time and times are the plainest and commonest of words, yet again they are profoundly obscure, and their meaning remains to be discovered. Augustine returns again and again to the point that we measure time in its passing. But he says, if you ask me how I know this, my answer is that I know it because we measure time. And we cannot measure what does not exist. And the past and the future do not exist. But how do we measure time present, since it has no extent? And where does time come from? And by what way does it pass? And where does it go to while we are measuring it? Where is it from? Obviously from the future. But what way does it pass? By the present? Where does it go? Into the past. In other words, it passes from that which does not exist, by way of that which lacks extension, into that which is no longer. The more he reflects on time and its measurement, the more Augustine is perplexed. The more he is forced to say, I still do not know what time is. He realizes that he has been talking of time for a long time. And this long time would not be a long time unless time has passed. But how do I know this, since I do not know what time is? It seems to him true that we measure time, and yet we must say, I do not know what I am measuring. It seems to him that time is certainly extendedness, but he must add, I do not know what it is extendedness of. Berkeley suggests that the difficulties in understanding time may be of our own making. Bid your servant meet you at such a time, in such a place, and he shall never stay to deliberate on the meaning of those words. But if time be taken exclusively of all those particular actions and ideas that diversify the day, merely for the continuation of existence or duration in the abstract, then it will perhaps gravel even a philosopher to comprehend it. For my own part, Berkeley goes on to say, whenever I attempt to frame a simple idea of time, abstracted from these succession of ideas in my own mind, which flows uniformly, and is participated by all things, I am lost and embrangled in inextricable difficulties. I have no notion of it at all. No notion of it at all. To those who conceive time as a mathematical magnitude or as a physical dimension, there seems to be no difficulty about its definition or a precise statement of its properties. So considered, time appears to be no less intelligible than space. For when it is so considered, it is being treated exactly like space, not as a property of things, nor as relative to bodies or their motions, but as an extensive manifold capable of being occupied by things, and in which they exist and move. As in what Einstein calls the four-dimensional space-time continuum, which comprises three space coordinates and one time coordinate. Time is merely one dimension among others. So in Newton's theory, time and space are also given parallel treatment. Times and spaces, Newton writes, are, as it were, the places as well of themselves as of all other things. All things are placed in time as to order of succession, and in space as to order of situation. Einstein criticizes Newtonian mechanics for its habit of treating time as an independent continuum. Yet Newton, no less than Einstein, appears to conceive time and space alike as dimensions, even if he conceives them in separation from one another. But if time and space are something to be occupied or filled, they can also be thought of as unoccupied or empty. The opposition discussed in the chapter on space between those who think of space in itself as empty and those who deny a void or vacuum seem to be paralleled here by the issue concerning empty time. Time apart from all change or motion, time in itself. Waiving for the moment the question whether such time exists or is only a mathematical abstraction, we can see that this time may be more susceptible to analysis than the time of ordinary experience, the time which, according to Lucretius, no one feels, by itself abstracted from the motion and calm rest of things. Newton explains that he does not define time and space, place and motion, because they are well known to all, but he observes that men commonly conceive these quantities under no other notions but from the relation they bear to sensible objects. He finds it necessary, therefore, to distinguish each of them into absolute and relative, true and apparent, mathematical and common. By absolute, true, and mathematical time, Newton means that which of itself and from its own nature flows equably without relation to anything external, and by another name is called duration. In contrast, relative, apparent, and common time is some sensible and external, whether accurate or unequable, measure of duration by the means of motion, which is commonly used instead of true time, such as an hour, a day, a month, a year. In astronomy, Newton points out, absolute time is distinguished from relative by the equation or correction of the apparent time, for the natural days are truly unequal, though they are commonly considered as equal and used for measures of time. Astronomers correct this inequality that they may measure the celestial motions by a more accurate time. Newton seems to be saying that time measures motion, and also that it is measured by it. If his distinction between absolute and relative time is ignored, his theory of time does not appear to be very different from that of Aristotle, who says, not only do we measure the movement by the time, but also the time by the movement. Insofar as movement or change involves a sequence in which one part comes after another, time measures it by numbering the befores and afters. But we also judge the length of the time according to the duration of the movement, and in this sense the movement measures time. How's that for confusing? As both Aristotle and Augustine point out, time measures rest as well as motion. For in Aristotle's words, all rest is in time. Time is not motion, but the number of motion. And what is at rest can be in the number of motion. Not everything that is not in motion can be said to be at rest, but only that which can be moved, though it actually is not moved. But where Aristotle is defining time as the measure of motion or rest, makes time an attribute of movement. Newton regards absolute time as the perfect measure of motion precisely because its nature is independent of all physical change. Only relative time depends on motion, and that is the time which is measured by motion, not the measure of it. Those who confound real quantities with their relations and sensible measures, Newton declares, defile the purity of mathematical and philosophical truths. Distinguishing between duration and time, Locke expresses in another way the difference between Newton and Aristotle. Time for Locke is that portion of duration which consists of definite periods and is measured by the motion of bodies. We must therefore carefully distinguish betwixt duration itself and the measures we make use of to judge its length. Duration in itself is to be considered as going on in one constant, equal uniform course, but none of the measures which we make use of can be known to do so. It seems wrong to Locke to define time as the measure of motion when, on the contrary, it is motion, the motion of the great and visible bodies of the world, which measures time. What Locke calls duration seems to be the same as Newton's absolute time. It is in no way relative to the existence of bodies or motion, just as space, or as he calls it, expansion, is not limited by matter, so duration is not limited by motion, as place is that portion of infinite space which is possessed by and comprehended within the material world and is thereby distinguished from the rest of expansion, so time is so much of infinite duration as is measured by and coexistent with the existence and motions of the great bodies of the universe. Many issues are raised by absolute time or infinite duration conceived as independent of all bodily motions. Einstein, for example, challenges the classical notion of simultaneity, according to which two events taking place at a great distance from one another are said to occur at the same time. That is, at the same moment in the absolute flow of time. Challenges the simultaneity. Before the advent of the theory of relativity, he writes, it had always been tacitly assumed in physics that the statement of time had an absolute significance, i.e., that it is independent of the state of motion of the body of reference. But if the world of physical events is a four-dimensional manifold in which the time coordinate is always associated with the space coordinates for any reference body under observation, then every reference body coordinate system has its own particular time. And Einstein adds, unless we are told the reference body to which the statement of time refers, there is no meaning in a statement of the time of an event. It's interesting they're referencing Einstein because I don't think any of his writings are in this set. I'm sure he's in the recommended reading list. Unless we are told the reference body to which the statement of time refers, there is no meaning in a statement of the time of an event. There is also the issue of the emptiness of the part of absolute time, or infinite duration, which comes before or after the existence of the world, comparable but to the issue concerning the void or empty space beyond the borders of the material universe. Those who regard time as relative to and inseparable from motion deny the possibility of such empty time. For Plato, as for Christian theologians like Augustine and Aquinas, time itself is created with the creation of the heavenly bodies and their motions. As the story of the world's becoming is told in the Timaeus, the Maker resolved to have a moving image of eternity, and when he set in order the heaven, he made this image eternal by moving according to number, while eternity itself rests in unity, and this image we call time. Time, then, and the heaven came into being at the same instant. Augustine undertakes to answer those who agree that God is the creator of the world, but have difficulties about the time of its creation. He asserts that there is no time before the world. For if eternity and time are rightly distinguished by this, that time does not exist without some movement and transition, while in eternity there is no change. Who does not see that there could have been no time had not some creature been made, which by some motion could give birth to change? I do not see, Augustine continues, how God can be said to have created the world after spaces of time had elapsed, unless it be said that prior to the world there was some creature by whose movement time could pass, but the existence of a creature prior to creation is impossible. Hence Augustine concludes that if in the world's creation change and motion were created, then the world and time were simultaneously created. Well, time to me makes a lot of sense because It's the feeling of having been. It's the feeling of consciousness. Feeling of being a conscious being experiencing the world in a manner that is not overwhelming. Because imagine we just had imagine there was no time, and we just sort of comprehended everything in sort of a static, just single. I don't know. It's hard to imagine anything existing without time. If we didn't have time, there would be no existence, because there would be no change. And it would seem that change is a fundamental aspect of being. Because the phenomenon of consciousness requires change. Otherwise, how would it compare existence to itself? Slight variations of itself. Can't perceive anything without time. Simultaneously created. Though the existence of a creature prior to creation is impossible, it is not impossible, according to Aquinas, for the created world to be coeval with its creator. While he rejects the opinion of those who assert that the world now exists without any dependence on God, and who deny that it was ever made by God, he entertains as possible the view that the world has a beginning, not of time, but of creation. Those who hold this view, he explains, mean that it was always made. For just as, if a foot were always in the dust from eternity, there would always be a footprint, which without doubt was created by him who trod on it, so also the world always was, because its maker always existed. It does not necessarily follow, Aquinas admits, that if God is the active cause of the world, he must be prior to the world in duration, because creation, by which he produced the world, is not a successive change. But Aquinas does not think that the question Whether the world and time began with creation or has always coexisted with its creator can be resolved by reason. The newness of the world, he says, is known only by revelation. That the world did not always exist, we hold by faith alone. It cannot be proved demonstratively. In saying this, he is not unmindful of the fact that Aristotle advances arguments to show that there can be no beginning to either time or motion. Since time cannot exist and is unthinkable, apart from the moment, and the moment is a kind of middle point, uniting, as it does in itself, both a beginning of future time and an end of past time, it follows that there must always be time. But if this is true of time, it is evident that it must also be true of motion, time being an attribute of motion. With one exception, all his predecessors, according to Aristotle, are in agreement that time is uncreated. In fact, he says, it is just this that enables Democritus to show that all things cannot have had a becoming. Plato alone asserts the creation of time, saying that it had a becoming together with the universe. But Aristotle's own arguments for the eternity of time and motion do not seem to Aquinas to be absolutely demonstrative, but only relatively so, viz., as against the arguments of some of the ancients who asserted that the world began to be in some actually impossible ways. As for the present moment, or the now of time, always requiring something which comes before as well as after, Aquinas admits that time cannot be made except according to some now. Yet, not because there is time in the first now, but because from it time begins. The position of Aquinas that arguments for the initiation or the endlessness of time are only dialectical seems to be confirmed by Kant in the Transcendental Dialectic, or the Critique of Pure Reason. The Transcendental Dialectic of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant sets forth as one of the cosmological antinomies the opposed arguments for the beginning of the world and for a world without beginning, the reasoning on either side being equal in its appearance of cogency. Neither conclusion, according to Kant, is genuinely demonstrated. But those who, like Newton and Locke, separate absolute time, or infinite duration, from the existence of a world in motion, seem to be unaffected by arguments which concern only the time of the material world. The time that is relative to motion. For them, Absolute or infinite time is eternity. It may be empty of motion, but it is filled with God's everlasting being. Though we make duration boundless, as certainly it is, Locke writes, we cannot yet extend it beyond all being. God, every one easily allows, fills eternity. God is not eternity, says Newton, but he is eternal. His duration reaches from eternity to eternity. He endures forever and is everywhere present. And by existing always and everywhere, he constitutes duration and space. The issue is again brought into focus by the denial that God's eternity can be identified with infinite or absolute time. Even supposing that the world always was, Aquinas writes, it would not be eternal in the sense in which God is. For the divine being is all being simultaneously without succession. He distinguishes the now that stands still as the eternal present from the continually shifting now in the flow of time's passing moments. For him, God's everlasting being does not endure through endless time, but rather exists unchanging in the eternal present. As eternity is the proper measure of being, so time is the proper measure of movement, and hence Aquinas writes, according as any being recedes from permanence in being and is subject to change, it recedes from eternity and is subject to time. The two meanings of eternity, infinite time and utter timelessness, are discussed in the chapter on eternity. The distinction between time and eternity, which is considered both there and here, seems to be understood differently by those who contrast timelessness with temporality, and by those who equate eternity with endless time. For the latter, the point of difference between eternity and time seems to be only one of infinite as opposed to limited duration. Yet, as we have just observed, writers like Newton and Locke also distinguish absolute or infinite time, which they tend to identify with eternity, from definite periods or limited spans of time, by making the one independent of the other, relative to and measured by motion. The question remains whether absolute time is real time or only a mathematical abstraction, whether it exists apart from perceived time. The experienced duration of observable motions, or the elapsed time of events in succession. Considering this question, Kant says that those who maintain the absolute reality of time and space, whether as essentials subsisting or only inhering as modifications in things, must find themselves at utter variance with the principles of experience itself. For if they decide for the first view, and make space and time into substances, this being the side taken by mathematical natural philosophers, they must admit two self-subsisting non-entities, infinite and eternal, which exist, yet without there being anything real, for the purpose of containing in themselves everything that is real. If they adopt the second view of inherence, which is preferred by some metaphysical natural philosophers, and regards space and time as relations abstracted from experience, they find themselves, in that case, necessitated to deny the validity of mathematical doctrine a priori in reference to real things. On Kant's own view, the synthetic judgments of mathematics can have the apodictic certainty of a priori propositions only if space and time are themselves a priori forms of intuition. As the a priori form of space makes possible the pure science of geometry, according to Kant, so the a priori form of time makes possible the pure science of numbers, i.e. arithmetic. But whereas space as the pure form of external intuition is limited to external phenomena alone, time as the form of the internal sense is for Kant the formal condition a priori of all phenomena whatsoever. Without sharing Kant's theory of a priori forms of intuition, or of the foundations of pure mathematics, other writers appear to agree to some extent with his denial of independent reality to time. Aristotle raises the question whether if soul did not exist, time would exist or not. He thinks the question may be fairly asked because if there cannot be someone to count, there cannot be anything that can be counted. So that evidently there cannot be number. For number is the counted or the countable. But if nothing but soul, or in soul reason, is qualified to count, there would not be time unless there were soul. Yet Aristotle qualifies this somewhat by adding that if movement can exist without soul, and the before and after are attributes of movement, time may exist as these qua numerable. Augustine takes a less qualified position, asking what it is that time is the extendedness of. He answers, probably of the mind itself, insisting that neither future nor past time can be measured because neither exists. Augustine concludes that it is only passing time we can measure, and that we can measure it only in the mind. It is in you, O my mind, he says, that I measure time. What I measure is the impress produced in you by things as they pass, and abiding in you when they have passed. I do not measure the things themselves, whose passage produced the impress. It is the impress that I measure when I measure time. Yet William James, while giving a similar analysis of our experience of time, insists that time is objective as well as subjective. Time and space relations, he writes, are impressed from without. The time and space in which the objects of our thought exist as independently of the mind as do those objects themselves. The time and space in which the objects of our thought exist exist as independently of the mind as do those objects themselves. The time and space relations between things do stamp copies within, as for example when things sequent in time impress their sequence on our memory. William James proposes a solution of the mystery of how time exists, at least how it exists in experience. So far as our experience goes, past and future can exist, at least as far. William James, while giving a similar analysis of our experience of time, insists that time is objective as well as subjective. Time and space relations, he writes, are impressed from without. The time and space in which the objects of our thought exist as independently of the mind as do those objects themselves. Right. William James proposes a solution of the mystery of time, of how time exists, at least how it exists in experience. So far as our experience goes, past and future can exist only in the present. But how can these extended parts of time exist in the present, if the present is but a fleeting moment, without any extent of duration? Gone, as James says, in the instant of becoming. His answer is in terms of something he calls the spacious present. Specious. Unlike the real present, the specious present is no knife edge, but a saddleback, with a certain breadth of its own on which we sit perched, and from which we look in two directions into time. The unit of composition of our perception of time is a duration, with a bow and a stern, as it were, a rearward and a forward-looking end. It is only as parts of this duration block that the relation of succession of time, end to the other, is succession of one end to the other is perceived. On the basis of some experimental evidence, James estimates that the specious present may vary in length from a few seconds to probably not more than a minute. It has a vaguely vanishing backward and forward fringe, but its nucleus is probably the dozen seconds or less that have just elapsed. The irreversible flow of time, the succession of moments which constitute the motion of the future through the present into the past, occurs in the specious present, though not, according to James, without the accompaniment of observed or experienced change. Awareness of change is the condition on which our perception of time's flow depends. But that awareness must take place in the specious present, with its content perceived as having one part earlier and the other part later. In consequence, James considers the specious present to be not only the original intuition of time, but also the original paragon prototype of all conceived times. The problems of time, its own process, and being, as well as its relation to all other existence and change, its character as an aspect of experience and as an object of thought, seems to belong to many subject matters, to psychology, and to experimental or mathematical physics, to the philosophy of nature, metaphysics, and theology. For some thinkers in our own time, notably Bergson, Whitehead, and Dewey, the concept of time, of the burgeoning future, of the continuum of events, seems to determine a whole philosophical outlook. It is not only equally decisive throughout the tradition of the great books, it is at least of critical significance in speculations about the origin and end of the world. And the contrast between physical and spiritual modes of being in the consideration of the processes of life, thought, and feeling, and in the analysis of more inclusive concepts such as that of order. The temporal relationships of succession and simultaneity, for example, may be the source from which we derive the notions of prior, posterior, and simultaneous, but they are traditionally viewed as exemplifying rather than exhausting these types of order. When Augustine deals with the perplexing theological question of the priority of eternity to time, he finds it necessary to distinguish priority and eternity, priority and time, priority and choice, priority and origin. When Aristotle deals with metaphysical questions concerning the order of cause and effect, of potentiality and actuality, of essence and accident, he differentiates between temporal and logical priority, and between priority in thought and priority in nature. When Harvey tries to solve the familiar biological riddle, which came first, the chicken or the egg, he also finds a solution in a distinction. The fowl is prior by nature, he writes, but the egg is prior in time. Space and spatial relationships, no less than time and the temporal, figure in the general analysis of order or relatedness and have a bearing on other problems in physics and philosophy. But in addition to times having more significance than space for the theologian, time also has peculiar importance for one subject matter in which space is of much less concern, namely history and the philosophy of history. Besides the general view which the historian takes of time as the locus of history, or the medium in which the pattern of history unfolds, the writer of history usually employs certain conventional time divisions to mark the major phases or epochs of the story he has to tell. Clocks and calendars record or represent the passage of time in conventional units, but these conventions have some natural basis in astronomical time, solar or sidereal. In contrast, the distinction between historic and prehistoric time, or the division of history into such periods as ancient, medieval, and modern, seems to be purely a matter of social or cultural convention. With Hegel, however, the division of the whole history into 3 epochs, and of each epoch again into 3 periods, follows from the dialectical triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which is the indwelling form of history's development. The division of each of the 3 phases of world history, the Oriental, the Greco-Roman, and the German worlds, into a first, second, and third period produces, in each case, the same pattern of origin, conflict, and resolution. For the most part, Hegel does not identify these 3 periods with ancient, medieval, and modern times, yet in one case, that of the German world, he does refer to the second period as the Middle Ages, and the third as the modern time. Where's Hegel? Oh, there he is. More recent guy. The most recent red-colored book. Such words as ancient and modern have conventional significance for most historians. Furthermore, the meanings of modernity, and antiquity are themselves subject to historical relativity. In the tradition of the great books, this appears most plainly in the references made to ancients and moderns by writers whom we today classify as ancient and medieval. Thucydides, for example, begins his history with a description of what is for him the antiquity of Greece. Nicomachus opens the introduction to arithmetic with a remark about the ancients who, under the leadership of Pythagoras, first made scientific systematic, defined philosophy as first made science systematic, defined philosophy as the love of wisdom. Mathematics, Aristotle says, has come to be identical with philosophy for modern thinkers. In another place, Aristotle contrasts the thinkers of the present day with the thinkers of old. And in still another, he speaks of ancient and truly traditional theories. Like Aristotle in the sphere of thought, so Tacitus in the sphere of politics frequently compares ancient and modern institutions or practices. In the Middle Ages, Aquinas speaks of the teachings of the early philosophers, and as frequently as Aristotle, he refers to ancient and modern doctrines. In the Renaissance, Kepler treats as ancient a scientist who, in point of time, comes much later than those whom Aristotle and Aquinas call modern. Classifying 3 schools of astronomical thought, he distinguishes an ancient one, which had Ptolemy as its Coryphaeus, from 2 modern ones, respectively headed by Copernicus and Tycho Brahe. Such references, which have occurred in all three periods of the Western tradition, suggest the probability that at some future date the whole tradition with which we are now acquainted will be referred to as the thought and culture of ancient times.